Have you ever noticed how one person's silence can feel louder than 100 words, and how that silence can slowly take over your thoughts, your mood, and even your sense of self? You tell yourself you don't care. You try to stay calm. You try to act normal. But inside, something keeps pulling you back into overthinking, replaying messages, reading between lines that may not even exist. And the worst part is not their distance. The worst part is what their distance does to your mind. Because when someone you are emotionally attached to becomes distant, especially an avoidant type, your brain does not interpret it as they need space. It interprets it as you are losing them. And that interpretation triggers something deep inside human psychology, a survival response that was never designed for modern relationships, but still runs your emotions like software from another time. And this is where everything begins to spiral. You start checking your phone more often than you admit. You start questioning your last conversation. You start wondering if you said something wrong, if you were too much or not enough. And slowly, without even realizing it, your emotional balance starts depending on their availability. Not because you want it, but because your mind is trying to regain control over uncertainty. Uncertainty is one of the strongest emotional triggers in human psychology. The brain hates not knowing. It prefers painful clarity over unclear silence. So, when someone becomes unpredictable, emotionally distant, or inconsistent, your mind does something interesting. It fills the gap with assumptions. And most of those assumptions are negative. This is where anger starts to form, not as a first reaction, but as a final stage of emotional overload. First comes confusion, then comes anxiety, then comes self-doubt. And finally, when your emotional system feels exhausted from trying to figure it out, it converts pain into anger. Because anger feels stronger than helplessness. It feels like control, but in reality, it is just emotional pressure looking for an exit. And if you are dealing with an avoidant person, this cycle becomes even more intense, because avoidant individuals often respond to emotional closeness with distance, not because they do not care, but because closeness can feel overwhelming to their nervous system. So when you move closer emotionally, they may pull back. And when they pull back, your attachment system activates even more strongly. This creates a psychological loop. The more you seek reassurance, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the more you seek reassurance. And in that loop, your emotional stability slowly gets replaced with emotional reactivity. But here is something most people never realize. The real conflict is not between you and them. The real conflict is between your need for emotional certainty and their discomfort with emotional intensity. Two nervous systems reacting differently to the same situation, but your mind does not see it that way. Your mind personalizes it. It turns it into meaning. It turns it into identity. It starts asking, why am I not enough for them? Instead of asking, what pattern is actually happening here? And that shift in interpretation is where your peace begins to disappear. Because when you interpret someone's distance as a reflection of your worth, every small silence becomes emotional damage. Every delayed reply becomes rejection. Every change in tone becomes a threat. And without realizing it, you start living in a state of emotional alertness, always waiting, always analyzing, always reacting internally, even when nothing is actually happening. This is why you get angry, not because you are a negative person, not because you lack patience, but because your emotional system is overloaded with unanswered uncertainty. Anger becomes the final expression of a mind that has been trying too long to find safety in something unpredictable. And here is where this video becomes important. Because if this pattern is not understood, it repeats with different people in different situations, but the same emotional outcome. Feeling drained, feeling confused, feeling too attached and then too frustrated. And slowly, relationships stop feeling like peace and start feeling like emotional survival. But there is a deeper truth most people miss. Your emotional reaction is not just about them. It is about how your nervous system learned to respond to inconsistency. Somewhere along the way, your mind connected love with attention, and attention with safety. So when attention disappears, even temporarily, your system interprets it as emotional danger. And that is why simple distance can feel so overwhelming. But what if the problem is not the distance itself? What if the problem is the meaning your mind attaches to it? Because the moment you change the meaning, you change the emotion. And when you change the emotion, you change your entire experience of the situation. Now, before going deeper into how to completely break this emotional cycle and stop getting triggered by avoidant behavior, there is something important you need to understand first. Something that will change how you see not only them, but your own emotional responses as well. And by the end of this video, you will learn how to stay emotionally grounded even when someone you care about becomes distant, without chasing, without overthinking, and without losing your inner peace. But first, you need to understand the exact shift that separates emotional control from emotional chaos. When that distance continues, something subtle starts happening inside the mind. And most people never notice it until it has already taken control. The emotions begin to tighten, the thoughts become repetitive, and a quiet inner pressure builds that feels almost impossible to explain. It does not feel like one clear emotion. It feels like many emotions mixed together at once: frustration, confusion, attachment, disappointment, and a strange need for answers that never arrive. This combination creates mental discomfort, and the brain does what it always does in discomfort. It searches for certainty, but when certainty is not available, the mind starts creating its own version of reality. It begins to assume intentions, predict outcomes, and write stories about what the other person might be thinking. And the more unclear the situation becomes, the more detailed those stories get. This is where emotional suffering silently grows. Because now you are no longer reacting to facts. You are reacting to interpretations. And interpretations are shaped by fear, not truth. The mind does not choose neutral explanations in emotional confusion. It chooses the ones that hurt the most because those feel urgent and important. At this stage, even small behaviors start to feel heavy. A delayed reply does not feel neutral anymore. It feels intentional. A short message does not feel simple. It feels like distance. And silence stops being silence. It starts feeling like a message you are supposed to decode. But the truth is very different. Avoidant behavior is not designed around emotional communication. It is often based on internal regulation. When emotional intensity increases, withdrawal becomes a coping response. It is not always about the other person losing interest. It is about their system trying to feel stable again. However, the mind that is emotionally attached does not interpret it that way. It interprets withdrawal as separation, and separation activates a deeper emotional alarm that was built long before this situation ever existed. That alarm is connected to attachment needs. Human beings are wired for connection. When connection feels uncertain, the nervous system reacts as if something essential is being threatened. This reaction is not logical. It is biological. It happens below conscious thought. That is why understanding it alone is not enough to stop it. It must be observed differently. As this pattern continues, something important begins to form inside behavior. The emotional focus shifts outward. Instead of staying centered, attention starts to revolve around the other person's actions. Every message, every delay, every change becomes a point of analysis. This creates mental exhaustion because the mind is now working constantly, trying to predict something that cannot be controlled. And the more energy goes into prediction, the less energy remains for emotional stability. This imbalance slowly increases irritability, not because the situation is getting worse, but because internal tension is rising. At some point, the emotional system reaches saturation. When that happens, sensitivity increases. Small things feel bigger than they are. Neutral situations feel loaded, and calm thinking becomes difficult. This is the stage where reactions become more impulsive, not because logic is absent, but because emotional pressure is dominating it. And this is where misunderstandings often deepen, because when reaction becomes faster than reflection, communication loses clarity. Words become sharper than intended. Silence becomes longer than necessary. And both sides begin reacting to each other's defenses instead of the actual situation. What makes this cycle even stronger is the lack of internal grounding. When emotional balance depends heavily on external behavior, stability becomes fragile. Any change outside immediately affects the inside. This creates a pattern where peace is no longer self-generated. It becomes dependent on responses, timing, and attention from someone else. But emotional stability was never meant to function this way. The mind becomes calmer when it is not constantly scanning for signals. It becomes stronger when it stops interpreting every action as meaningful, and it becomes clearer when it understands that not every emotional gap requires immediate explanation. There is also another hidden layer in this dynamic. The desire to fix the distance often increases emotional intensity instead of reducing it. Trying to restore closeness too quickly can sometimes create more pressure in the interaction, and pressure usually leads to more withdrawal. This is how the cycle quietly reinforces itself without intention. Over time, this creates emotional fatigue, not sudden exhaustion, but slow depletion, the kind where patience feels thinner, thoughts feel heavier, and emotional responses feel harder to control. And in that state, even normal situations start feeling emotionally charged. But underneath all of this, there is a simple pattern repeating again and again. Perceived distance creates interpretation. Interpretation creates emotional reaction. Reaction creates behavior. Behavior influences response. And response reinforces the original perception. This loop continues until something interrupts it. And the interruption does not come from changing the other person. It comes from changing the point where meaning is created. Because once meaning changes, emotional response changes with it. And when response changes, the entire dynamic starts to shift naturally. This is why understanding your internal process matters more than analyzing external behavior. Because external behavior will always vary, but internal interpretation is where control actually exists. And once this becomes clear, the focus slowly moves away from reaction and toward awareness. Not to suppress emotion, but to understand it before it becomes action. This understanding becomes the foundation for breaking the cycle completely, which is exactly what comes next. At a certain point in this pattern, something important begins to happen inside awareness. There is a small gap between what occurs outside and how it is felt inside. Most people move through that gap instantly without noticing it, but that gap is where emotional control is either lost or regained. When attention is fully absorbed in external behavior, reactions feel automatic. There is no space to pause. Thoughts move directly into emotion, and emotion moves directly into action. But when awareness expands, even slightly, something different becomes possible. There is a moment where observation replaces immediate reaction. In that moment, the intensity begins to soften. The situation itself has not changed, but the relationship with it has changed. Instead of being inside the emotional wave, there is now a sense of watching it form. And this shift is powerful because it interrupts the automatic chain that usually leads to escalation. This interruption is not about suppression. It is about recognition. Recognition that what is being felt is not the full truth of the situation, but a response created by internal patterns. When this becomes clear, the emotional charge loses some of its control. The mind starts to slow down because it is no longer fully identified with the reaction. At this stage, the focus begins to move inward. Instead of searching for meaning in external behavior, attention starts to return to internal experience. The question shifts subtly from "what are they doing?" to "what is happening inside right now?" This change may seem small, but it completely alters emotional direction, because now the mind is no longer chasing answers outside. It is observing processes inside. And when attention moves inward, something stabilizing begins to develop. There is less urgency, less mental noise, less need to resolve everything immediately. The emotional system starts to regulate itself because it is no longer being fueled by constant interpretation. One of the strongest drivers of emotional imbalance is continuous interpretation without pause. When every action is assigned meaning, the mind never rests. But when interpretation is slowed down, emotional intensity naturally reduces. This is where clarity begins to form. Clarity does not come from finding perfect answers. It comes from reducing unnecessary assumptions. When assumptions decrease, emotional reactions also decrease. And when reactions decrease, the nervous system begins to feel safer again. At this point, a deeper realization starts to emerge. Not every emotional reaction requires action. Not every uncomfortable feeling requires correction. Sometimes emotions simply need space to exist without being turned into decisions. This understanding creates a different kind of strength, a strength that is not reactive but steady. Steadiness is built when internal experience is allowed to pass without immediate interference. This does not mean ignoring feelings. It means allowing them to exist without letting them dictate behavior instantly. When this begins to happen consistently, emotional dependence on external behavior weakens. The mind stops treating every signal as urgent. Instead, it starts categorizing experiences with more balance. Some things are important, some things are temporary, some things do not require response at all. This natural sorting reduces internal chaos. And as chaos reduces, perception becomes clearer. The same situation that once felt overwhelming now feels more manageable. Not because the situation has changed, but because the internal reaction has changed. There is also a shift in emotional energy. Previously, most energy was directed outward, trying to understand or control what was happening. Now, energy is being redirected inward, supporting stability instead of reaction. This redistribution creates a calmer mental state. In this calmer state, behavior begins to change naturally. There is less urgency in communication, less emotional pressure in responses, less need to resolve uncertainty immediately. This creates a different presence entirely, a presence that is no longer driven by emotional instability, but by internal balance. And this balance has a noticeable effect on interaction dynamics. When emotional pressure is reduced, interactions lose their tension. There is more space between stimulus and response, and in that space, choices become more intentional rather than automatic. This is where real emotional strength develops, not in controlling others, but in controlling internal response patterns. Because once internal reactions are no longer automatic, external behavior loses its power to destabilize. Another important shift happens at this stage. The need for constant validation begins to weaken. Instead of relying on external confirmation for emotional safety, there is a growing sense of internal grounding. This does not happen suddenly. It develops gradually as emotional awareness increases, and as validation dependence decreases, emotional resilience increases. Resilience here does not mean being unaffected. It means being able to experience emotional discomfort without losing stability. It means allowing uncertainty to exist without turning it into panic or urgency. This creates a new kind of emotional independence, one where distance, silence, or inconsistency no longer automatically triggers inner disruption. The mind learns to separate external behavior from internal value, and this separation is what protects peace. At this point, something subtle but powerful becomes noticeable. The same situations that once created emotional storms now create only mild reactions, not because feelings have disappeared, but because interpretation has changed. And interpretation is what shapes emotional experience more than the event itself. This is the foundation of emotional control. Not eliminating feelings, but understanding how they are formed. Not avoiding discomfort, but preventing it from growing through unnecessary meaning. And not reacting instantly, but allowing awareness to guide response. As this understanding deepens, emotional stability becomes less effortful. It starts to feel natural, less like control and more like clarity. And from this clarity, the next transformation begins to take shape. At this stage, a deeper understanding starts forming, one that changes the entire way emotional situations are experienced. It becomes clear that most distress does not come from events themselves, but from the speed at which meaning is assigned to them. When meaning is created too quickly, emotional balance collapses before awareness even has a chance to intervene. This is why slowing down perception becomes so powerful. When there is space between what happens and what is concluded about it, emotional intensity loses its grip. The mind no longer jumps directly into conclusions. Instead, it begins to observe before deciding. And observation changes everything, because observation removes exaggeration. It reduces distortion. It allows reality to appear closer to what it actually is, rather than what fear interprets it to be. In this space, emotional reactions lose their sharpness and responses become more measured. One of the most important shifts at this level is the ability to separate internal state from external behavior. When these two are fused, every external change feels personal. But when they are separated, external behavior becomes just information, not identity. This separation creates emotional relief. Suddenly, silence is no longer loaded with meaning. Distance is no longer automatically translated into rejection. Variations in communication are no longer treated as emotional signals about worth. Instead, They are seen as fluctuations in human behavior that do not require personal attachment. And this change in perception reduces emotional dependency. Dependency grows when external input is treated as a source of emotional regulation, but when internal stability becomes the primary source, external behavior loses its controlling influence. This does not eliminate sensitivity, but it removes volatility. At this point, a quiet transformation begins inside mindset. Reactivity starts to weaken, not through force, but through understanding. The mind begins to recognize that immediate emotional response often creates more imbalance than resolution. So instead of reacting instantly, there is a growing tendency to wait, observe, and then respond. This waiting is not passive, it is structured awareness. In that pause, emotional energy settles, thoughts organize themselves, initial intensity decreases, and what remains is a more accurate sense of the situation. This accuracy leads to better emotional decisions. Another important change happens in expectation. Previously, expectation was tightly linked to behavior. Certain actions were expected to maintain emotional comfort. When those expectations were not met, discomfort followed quickly. But as awareness increases, expectations begin to loosen, not disappear, but soften. Softened expectations create emotional flexibility, and flexibility reduces suffering, because rigid expectations turn every deviation into disappointment. Flexible expectations allow variation without emotional collapse. This flexibility also changes how interactions are experienced. Instead of interpreting every moment as significant, there is a growing ability to let moments exist without assigning weight to them. Not every silence becomes meaningful. Not every message becomes symbolic. Not every delay becomes emotional evidence. This reduces mental overactivity. And when mental overactivity decreases, emotional clarity increases. The mind is no longer constantly constructing narratives. It is simply processing reality as it unfolds, without excessive layering. At this level, something even more important develops: emotional self-reliance. Self-reliance here does not mean isolation. It means internal stability that does not depend heavily on external validation. Emotional grounding begins to come from within rather than from response patterns. This shift is subtle but powerful, because when emotional grounding is internal, external inconsistency loses its ability to destabilize. There is still awareness of behavior, but it no longer dictates inner state. This creates a steady emotional baseline. From this baseline, communication changes naturally. There is less urgency in expression, less emotional pressure in words, less need to extract reassurance. Instead, interaction becomes more neutral, more balanced, and less reactive. And this neutrality has an unexpected effect. It reduces emotional tension in the entire dynamic. When one side is no longer escalating emotionally, the interaction itself becomes calmer, not because the other person has changed, but because the emotional energy being brought into the situation has changed. Another key development at this stage is the reduction of internal resistance. Previously, emotional discomfort was often met with resistance, a desire to fix, change, or immediately resolve it. But now, discomfort is allowed to exist without immediate interference. This acceptance reduces internal conflict, and reduced conflict creates stability, because emotional instability is often the result of resisting internal experience. When resistance decreases, emotional waves become less violent. They still appear, but they pass more smoothly. This smoother emotional movement creates resilience. Resilience here is not hardness, it is adaptability. The ability to experience shifts without losing inner balance. The ability to remain grounded even when emotional fluctuations occur. And as resilience grows, perspective expands. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel smaller in scale, not because they are less important, but because they are no longer magnified by internal reaction. The mind starts seeing patterns instead of isolated moments. This pattern recognition is crucial because it reveals repetition. It shows how emotional cycles form and repeat. And once repetition is visible, it becomes easier to interrupt. Awareness becomes the point of change. At this level, emotional control is no longer an effort. It becomes a byproduct of understanding. The mind is no longer fighting reactions. It is simply no longer feeding them. And from here, a deeper shift becomes possible, one that moves beyond managing reactions and into transforming the entire emotional response system itself.